Hey, what's good, y'all? I just mastered this new track. It's the Cutwoes remix of Wiersma's new single, Tell Somebody. The original mix is this beautiful, like, piano house banger with, like, gospel-y vocals in it. And the Cutwoes remix that I'm going to be focusing on today is this, like, breaks flip of it, like an amen break and like big elegant piano progression from the original and rave vocals and what's not to like, right? Lots of syncopation, great remix. And it needed a little work, but not too much work. So I thought it would be a good one to feature for something like this. So I'm going to show you what I did to the mix, but first let's just take a listen to, like, I don't know, a minute and a half, something like that, of the original mix, so you can get a feel for it, but not long enough to get too used to it. All right, so let's have a listen. Okay, so nice tune, real nice tune. Couple issues to clean up. It's got a nice kind of modern sound, but it's also got an edge to it that is gonna hurt on a live sound system for sure. It's the hats are just a little strident. The snare is a little harsh. Um, there's things that need polishing in this mix. Um, so yeah, let's start talking about that, I guess. The first thing I did was I rejected this mix because the hat that entered in that last section we were listening to, the one that's on the right here, it just jumps out of the mix a little too much. It sticks out a little much, and it's kind of making the soundstage lean that way a little too much. So I had the mixer make a revision for me where he pulled that hat down a little bit, and that sounds like this. Okay, just it's integrated a little better in the mix. It doesn't feel like the sound stage is leaning that way as much anymore. It just feels better. All the other balances in the mix felt correct to me. That was the only thing that really jumped out. And, obviously at first I tried to correct it through a variety of means, like EQing just the right side or a dynamic band on just the right side. But all of it touched the mix a little too much. It screwed with the sound staging a little bit too much. So I got, the best holistic fix to that, which is a new mix, right? And from there, I was ready to start the mastering process. So the first thing I did was I got a level going for the mix. All right. And I leveled it based off of, the main passages in the song. Let's go back to this one. I shot out 2 clippers for this and a couple limiters. I'll A/B them for you real quick. Oh, and I've level matched the mix to the master perceptually, so that the only thing we're really comparing here is tone. If somebody ever A/Bs something for you and it isn't gain matched, it's worthless. And unless things are perceptually the same level, you're not going to be able to make an objective decision. We're always going to be biased towards the louder of the two. So that's the reason why I'm playing the master a little quieter, and the mix is the same level as it is, so that I can be open and transparent with you about my process and what I'm applying to it. Because yeah, you got to get it loud. And I did. I got it 6 dB louder than the mix. No big deal. And you have to get it to a level, but it's the way that you get it there that matters. And unless you're checking religiously against the mix at the same level, you don't really know the full scope of what you're adding to that mix. And not all of it's going to be good. And you need to be mindful of that when you work, whether it's on your own music, other people's music. Limiters and clippers are getting real good, and they are getting real subtle in the ways that they screw things up, but they still screw things up in a couple ways, some of which I'll get into in a bit. But anyway, that's why we're evaluating against the mix at the same level. So let's shoot out these clippers real quick. I wound up going with ash over gold clip. I'll show you what gold clip sounds like real quick. Listen to the kick and the bass in this particularly. Okay, so that's with gold clip in. Here's with ash in. A little cleaner, a little less veiled sounding. Sometimes gold clip puts this like sheen on top of mixes that doesn't always happen to be the right thing for the mix. I also shot out Limitless versus Ozone versus a couple other things. Closest I got was Ozone versus Limitless, and they drop into Elevate as the second stage limiter in this mix. I'll show you the difference between Limitless, and listen to the imaging, listen to the width of the sound stage. I'll show you Ozone first, and then I'll show you Limitless. Here's Ozone. Okay, and here's Limitless. So it's a little wider, a little deeper to my ear, and that's why I like Limitless so much, is it treats the sound stage a little more respectfully than the other options. So that's why I like to use it as a first stage limiter. Now, it'll distort before a lot of other options out there will. That isn't the thing that it really excels at, per se, but it does take good care of your sound staging. So I appreciated that about it in this mix. I liked what it did with the piano verb compared to Ozone. Ozone kind of flattened it a little more. So in this case, I went with Limitless. On another master, it may have been Ozone, depending on the goals for the mix. But okay, so that's my clipping and limiting sorted. There is one other thing going on at this stage, and it's going to sound a little silly, but sometimes I stay in the box and just work with plugins. Sometimes I go out of the box and work with, my mastering EQs and compressor and what have you. But sometimes I'll just go out of the box to go through my transfer console. So I've got this NIF mastering controller transfer console, of which there are very few in the world. I believe less than 10 last I checked. And they're all made a little differently. And the thing that really struck me about this transfer console is even in completely neutral settings, which it is in at this moment, it has this tendency to add just a little bit of euphonic width to mixes in a way that doesn't compromise the center. And that's interesting to me because usually when you go out into hardware and it gets a little wider, my assertion is that it's not a good tolerance between the left and right channel components that's making for a little bit of deviation, that's making it sound a little wider. But in those cases, you lose a little bit of center channel cohesion. I find that in this transfer console, I get to have my cake and eat it too. It gets just a little bit wider, but my center channel stays clean and solid. And you know, sometimes I go with it, sometimes I don't go with it. I'll show you the difference so you can hear. It's not like a massive difference. It's really not. My converters are very clean and my mastering console is very clean, but it does add just a little bit of something. And sometimes going out of the converters takes a little bit of edge off the top of mixes, which in turn can make the bass range sound just a little bit nicer. And sometimes that works out in a mix's favor. This mix is a little edgy throughout. So this is a good candidate for me to send out into analog and right back in, just to take a little bit of that digital edge off of it. On other mixes, it might dull it a little too much, but on this one, I thought it was good. So here's Staying in the Box, so you can hear what that sounds like. And here is going out through my converters and transfer console. A little more of this, a little bit more of this. Not a lot, obviously, but just enough to be worth the price of admission. All right, so I went with that too. Now, I guess I should talk about my static settings for this mix before I get into anything else. So, didn't do anything terribly fancy with EQ. I thought the balance was real nice on this mix for the most part. What I did do was I added a low shelf down in the infrasonic range. I try not to use high pass filters anymore because I feel like they steal too much of the energy out of kicks. Some kicks go quite low and sometimes it's a nice thing. And you feel like you've lost something when you get rid of it. But on this particular mix, I think it made the kicks a little shorter, a little tighter. And in doing so, it made them a little punchier. I think it may have cleaned up some stuff in the bass in the infrasonic range too. I'll let you be the judge of that. Here it is with that low shelf removed. And here's with that low shelf engaged. Doesn't it feel like the kick just jumps out like a little bit more? That's what we're after here. And I did a cheeky little boost right at the fundamental of the kick drum too, for good measure, just to give it just a little bit more emphasis. And then I cracked into some multiplicity. I noticed this mix is edgy, like throughout. The breakdowns and the intro and outro, or the intro is real edgy, real harsh, a little too upfront for my taste. It's like right here, you know, but then when the main passage drops, it feels like it backs off a little bit. And that isn't really what you want in an intro and a breakdown. It's supposed to be like a diminuendo. It's supposed to be a period during which you build the energy of the musical material so that when you hit the main passage, it feels like you've arrived somewhere, like it's rewarding in some way, like it's distinct from the previous passage, right? So I'll get into the level bit in a bit, but with regard to the harshness, this was my first angle of attack on that, and mostly for the main passages where the bass and the drums are present. This little guy is just a dynamic band, which is pulled down 0.7 dB, and then it's got a super fast attack, pretty fast release, and the idea is it just grabs onto those snare and hi-hat transients that are jumping out of the mix a little too much and just reins them back in a little bit so that they seed into the mix and they aren't quite as harsh on a live sound system where they're just sort of sitting in the sound stage instead of jumping out of it. So I'll show you the difference. Here's without. And here's with it in. So it just puts a little bit of space between you and the transients of those hi-hats. Puts them back into the speaker a little bit as opposed to being in your eardrum. Not a big move, but, you know, that's what mastering is just the culmination of small minutial changes that add up to something meaningful when you get all of them going, right? So something I didn't wind up going with, but that I played with for a while, and which I think is worth mentioning just for future sake, is I also did a dynamic band right around the kick fundamental, but broad enough to encompass a lot of the bass notes too, most of the bass notes. And my goal here was to kind of lock the kick into the bass a little bit better, to try and clean it up a little bit in the mix, try and get the bass and the kick to move together, since it ducks the bass when it ducks the kick, so that there will be a little bit of like grouping and congruence between the kick and bass, kind of like bus compressing them. It basically is bus compressing a specific frequency range of them together, and sometimes that gets you a little better integration when a kick just feels a little detached from a mix. So I'll show you with it engaged and then without. Again, fast attack, pretty quick release. You just want it to contour to the kick drum, right? So here it is engaged. And here it is without. And I wound up keeping it because I missed some of that impulse from the kick. I like kick drums that jump out of the speaker a little bit. They just sound bigger, and they sound bigger in the club for it too. So I like to leave them a little bit ahead, but I considered it just for the sake of cleaning up the kick and bass a little. But to be quite honest, the kick was distorted when I got it, and it's going to be distorted when it hits the retailers, regardless of what I do. So I figured let's lean into it and give it a kick that has some energy, right? But while I'm on the topic, I love doing stuff like this, and it's not just gluing kick drums into basses. Oh, no. There's so much more you can do in the bass range with multiplicity. You can compress and expand above the threshold, but you can also compress or expand below the threshold too. And what that lets you do is establish a threshold where the kick triggers it. And then if you start compressing below the threshold, you can do stuff like this. Bass element? What bass element? How cool is that? It's like I had a fader for the bass. How convenient is that? Multiplicity is incredible. Yeah, it's $200, but go spend the money. It'll save your life someday, I promise. I use this on every master. This is my little mix fixer on pretty much everything. So those are my static settings for the mix. So now we've got my clippers, my limiters, my analog path, my static settings that are going on throughout the mix. But that's really just the beginning of how I work. And I don't know if it's like this with every mastering engineer. It probably isn't. There's a lot of mastering engineers that have kind of a hands-off approach. They have sort of an old world mentality. They're used to not being able to automate a whole lot in the process, or it being unwieldy to do so. So they largely avoid it and work on static settings that work throughout a mix. But from my perspective, it would seem egotistical to think that a song that changes throughout its program could be satisfied and optimized throughout with one setting to rule them all that just works perfectly through every section, in the breakdowns, in the big sections, everywhere. In the Q beats, it doesn't, when you think about it, it doesn't seem right? I mean, music changes throughout, so it would only seem reasonable that your process for treating that arrangement should vary a little throughout, and mine does, very much so. One big reason for that for me is I don't have complete control over how mixers work, right? Some guys mix into limiters, so they have some idea of how the limiter or clipper is going to load their mix when it's up to, mastered level, right? Some guys don't do that. And if you've worked into a limiter before, you've probably noticed that the level changes. The perceptual level changes when you push like a breakdown into a limiter versus a main passage. The breakdowns tend to get louder than the main passage does. They're out of ratio. They get more loudness potential than the main passage does because they're not being hindered by the bass and the kick drum and all these things that take up so much headroom and energy in the mix. So the level can just jump way up. And now you've got things like, a piano, a vocal hitting your clipper that you don't want hitting it and harshing it up really badly. And just like breakdowns that make the main passages seem small and compressed, quite frankly. So I use a little trick I call conducting to get around that in my mastering process. And if you look, I've cut up this song into sections. And if you look at these sections, you'll see a little red line that moves around in the different passages, and that represents volume. Now, am I turning it up and down in the sense that you're going to hear it as volume? Not exactly, because remember, we're hitting this into clipper and limiters. So it's going to be loaded. It's going to be hitting full scale. It's just a matter of how hard we're making it hit full scale in these passages, right? So I'm not turning these down in the sense that you would necessarily notice it like would happen in a mix if you just turn a fader down, because we're not changing the level. We're changing the dynamic by doing this. And that lets you inject macro dynamics, the dynamics of individual passages in a song. It lets you manipulate those and re-inject a little bit of dynamics into the quieter passages, the passages that should be quieter than the main passages. And that way, when you when you go into the quieter passages, it feels like a distinct new section of the song. And then when you go out of those quieter passages back into the sections with the drums and the bass, it does actually get a little louder and a little more compressed, and it sounds bigger for it, and it works. I mean, everybody wants to be loud as hell. Like, that's a fact of life at this point. I get it. But if you're loud as hell from the intro through the outro, it's not going to be impactful in the same way that it is if you save a little bit of dynamics, at least for your main passages, the parts that you want to be especially loud and efficient, right? If you save a little bit of dynamic for those sections, they're going to sound bigger, just as a consequence of the contrast of dynamic range between the quieter passages and the louder ones. And I mean, isn't that kind of how music should work? Once we have this, dynamic arrangement of music that evolves over time, do you really want to hit it into a clipper and limiter that's going to do the exact same thing to it throughout? When you really get down to it and think about like best serving the emotional energy of the material, no, probably not. You're probably not going to want your intros to be louder than your main passage. That doesn't feel right on a gut instinct level, And, in the case of this mix, you may or may not have noticed that the intro was a little too loud and the breakdowns are a little too loud. But I guarantee you, once you load this into a clipper and some limiters, you're going to notice it. Okay, I noticed it off the bat, but I do this a lot. But listen to what it sounds like if I just load this intro into my clipper and limiters without doing any conducting, where it's just the level that the mixer gave me. Check this shit out. It doesn't go anywhere. Like, it just feels like more of the same section of the song. Okay? But I added a little conducting to it, and check this out. Watch how this transitions. Doesn't that feel a little more fulfilling than the previous example? Just not having all those intro transients like right there, and just having that little extra space to step up into that section. It feels more musical to me. I hope that it feels more musical to you. Because, when every part of your song is screamingly loud, it's fatiguing. If you don't give your ears a break, you won't have the opportunity to be like, damn, that hits, when it starts hitting again. But if you put those little breaks in the music there for a reason, right? Use it in your engineering. I mean, follow that in the engineering. The music has to influence your process as directly as possible. That's the key to doing really musical mastering, is just think about it in terms of the music. Don't think about it in terms of the technical shit that you're doing. Think about it in terms of, how does this work into the way that the music was arranged? And does it better serve that material for it, right? So I'll give you one more example. Here is the transition between between this first breakdown here into the next main passage. This is the non-conducted version. Okay, and here's the conducted version. Isn't that a little more fun? I think that's more fun. So I did that throughout to varying degrees. And you'll notice, like, I even brought up some sections with drums versus prior sections with the drums, and that's because the piano leaves here. So I've got a little more room, so I can cook it a little harder, and it'll be a little bigger sounding there. So I'm just like using my available headroom as efficiently as possible throughout the song, not just in the chunk that you check out while you're dialing in your settings and then being like, well, I hope the rest of the song sounds good through this. No, get proactive, chop the shit up, make every section of the song perfect. Okay? At least that's how I do it. So that is the first stage of the dynamic work that I did on this master. The second stage was applying effects to individual, these are called items. When you a waveform is called an item in Reaper. And these effects boxes represent where I've applied plugins directly to just that individual chunk of the song. Reaper has an object-oriented effects system, which constitutes it as what I like to define a real DAW. If you're trying to master stereo mixes in a DAW that doesn't have object-oriented effects, delete that shit. Buy Reaper. It's $60. Like, it goes back to what I'm talking about. Do you want to just have static settings for your song throughout? Hopefully not. And secondarily, do you want to be drawing envelopes in to automate this stuff for different sections? No. I have all kinds of different settings going on for my plugin. I have like soothe settings going on where I've tweaked all sorts of things. The amount of time it would take to automate that in a mix versus putting plugins on the mix, chopping it up and changing the settings of those plugins in different chunks of it. The difference in workflow is orders of magnitude in terms of like how much work you have to do. This is a game changer for me. I used to master in Pro Tools, and then I met Bob Katz and he put me onto Sequoia, and it had object-oriented effects. And that was the first time I ever saw it. And I was like, well, I'm getting rid of Pro Tools, and I did, and I bought it. And then a couple of years later, I found Reaper, which does all the good things that Sequoia does, but it's more DSP efficient, and it costs $60. So I kicked out Sequoia, and now I use Reaper, and I love it to death, and I highly recommend it for all sorts of reasons that I'll get into in future videos probably. But anyway, let's listen again to my conducted version and how it transitions into this first passage here. Listen to the hats and the snare and the vocal transients in this intro versus the main passage that follows it, okay? Okay, so it still feels small. The main section still feels smaller, and it's because of all those strident transients and the harshness that's inherent in the snare and the level of the snare because of the aforementioned lack of loading happening on my limiters and so on. So I tried a few things to rein in these transients. First thing I tried was split EQ, which lets you manipulate. It's like an EQ, but it lets you EQ the transients separately from the sustain of the sound you're working on. So I tried pulling the transients down in the upper mid-range and the highs, but it kind of fucked with my imaging too much. So I bailed on that. And then I tried getting real manual with Pro Q3 with a bunch of like dynamic notch bands, but I didn't have good enough specificity on that. It was too broad of an issue. So no joy there. Tried multiplicity with a broader dynamic band, but that killed too much of the energy of the mix, so I bailed on that too. And weirdly enough, the thing that I landed on here was Soothe. I usually avoid this in stereo mastering unless it's absolutely mission critical, because it has a tendency to remove low level detail from mixes. It has a tendency to close in the ambience depth of a mix a little bit, reduce the depth of the mix just a little bit. And those are things that I hate and I avoid like the plague. The last thing I want to do is send in a master that's less detailed than the mix. And if you're not careful, this thing can do that in spades. So I very mindfully applied some soothe just to the intro and to the breakdowns, which I felt were a little too harsh. Have a listen to what this sounds and listen to how it transitions into the main passage. Now it feels like it's a big moment when the drums and the bass come in. That's what I've been trying to get to with this mix, is just creating musical arcs of dynamics and reining in the transients enough that it doesn't make the small sections sound big and the big sections sound small, if that makes any sense. And this was the combination of elements that made it happen: the conducting and the soothe. Just on the intros and the breakdowns. I don't apply it to any of the main passages, because if I did, it would erode some of the punch of the snare. I know it would make it sound a little smaller, and we don't want that. And honestly, it's not as harsh once you get into those main passages. I think there was some sort of bus compression, maybe into saturation, that was going on in the mix that loaded the breakdowns a little differently than the main passages. Who knows what caused it in the mix, but obviously the clipping and limiting exacerbated that to a certain degree, but it works really well in the main passages. So we're just trying to massage the rest of the mix around that main passage and inject a little bit of macro dynamics back into the mix while we're reducing the micro dynamics of the main passages. We make the main passages louder. We make the main passages where there aren't drums and bass a little smaller, a little more concise, so that we have that contrast that feels rewarding when you transition between sections of the song, okay? So let's talk a little bit about what I did actually, let's check out this weird little section over here. I'm going to play a little bit of the previous section into this section, and I'll give you the non-conducted version first with no soothe, no dynamic processing, so you can hear what it would sound like if we went straight out of the mix into the clippers and limiters, okay? Okay, so in the mix, it sounds a lot smaller than it does here, right? There's no bass in this section, so this section comes up inherently. On top of that, it has very strident transients. They're just jumping out of the speakers and just like attacking my fucking eardrums. And I know they'll do the same thing on a big Function 1 system. So we've got to make this section a little bit more polite. All right. First thing I did was the most holistic approach, which was to conduct it and not apply any processing yet. That got me to here. So that's part of the equation. It definitely feels more correct next to the previous section. Like this isn't some big section in the song. This is a transitional section with some edits in it. And we don't want this section to be a total ear burner live. So it's turned down a little. That much feels right. But the next thing I did was I added some soothe in this section, just to rein those transients in a little bit more, make it a little less harsh. And then in addition to that, I also added a dynamic band in multiplicity centered at 3K just to dig more in to those really jumpy transients that are way in the front of the soundstage. I want to draw those back into the speakers just a little bit, so that they aren't attacking you quite as much in this part of the song. Have a listen to this. Isn't that nice? Doesn't that seem like much less likely to destroy your ears in a club? I think so. And it doesn't make the section before it seem inconsequential next to it. I mean, this was a big moment in the song. The piano's there, the vocals there, the amen breaks there. Like, that's the business. That's the business end of this song. You don't want some transitional section after it to make it seem small in comparison. That doesn't make musical sense, right? So that was my approach in that chunk of the song. Otherwise, it's basically what I've expressed so far, with varying settings in the different breakdowns with different levels of reduction in each of those sections. I tailored each one just to make the next drop more impactful. I turn it down just enough to get that impact out of the next drop. And you'll notice that like shorter sections, I might leave it a little louder, because it isn't a big break. It's a short break. So you don't want to lose too much energy. But in these longer sections, I do bring it down because this is like a big moment in the song where we're refocusing and we're taking it down to ground level. And that's where you want to get a little bit of dynamic back. But fortunately, when I add that dynamic back, those transients aren't getting worse by not being clipped and limited as much. I have that controlled because soothe is happening pre-clip gain. Okay, so it's applying the same amount of this regardless of the level, and that ensures that I'm going to have my transients controlled regardless of what level I set this thing at. Whereas if I had it on my channel, I wouldn't have that because it's post item level. But the item effects are pre-item level, which is just so incredibly helpful for doing my kind of process in mastering. It's so good. Sequoia too. I mean, they didn't invent this, and Studio One does it now too. Like, this Reaper's not the only game in town, but it does a lot of other shit that I really enjoy that other DAWs can't do, and we'll get there in future videos. So yeah, I think that's basically everything I did for this master. I hope you got something out of this. I hope you had a little bit of fun. I hope you like the song. I want to big up Wiersma, and I really want to big up Cutwoes for doing just an incredible remix. I mean, the original is a banger too. I am a sucker for like 90s piano house, and it is just a love letter to that with just a little bit of gospel house chucked in there for good measure, and woof, love it. Love this single. I hope all of you go buy it and support them. A big shout out to John Debo, the mix engineer on this. I wouldn't be coming out with masters that sound this nice if it wasn't for John. So yeah, that's it. Take care, y'all.